All right, well, joining us on the line today is Professor Richard Wolff. He is an American economist. He is the professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York. You've also taught at Yale, haven't you? And you've also we talked about this last time you were on the program. You have been through the entire Ivy League system, and you have quite a story.
Yes, I did. I spent my 10 years of university life, first at Harvard, and then I went to Stanford, and I finished up at Yale. So I'm kind of a poster boy for the elite education system in the United States.
Oh, sure.
They did try. They put in a good effort to convince me that our economic system is the best and the only one and just the greatest thing since sliced bread. But they never quite succeeded, and that's been my history pretty much since.
Richard, it's such a bizarre election cycle. 2016 is so bizarre. I mean, you take a look at what's happening now between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Donald Trump, a guy who no one ever saw coming, and now with the full force of his machine, so to speak, he is actually taking on the Clinton machine, which many of us could never see coming. You know, from my perspective, and I'm really interested in your perspective, but let me just tell you real quickly, from my perspective, Clinton was the one to beat. Bernie Sanders had an amazing message that was different, but it never seemed like he had much of a chance, and Trump, who ever saw him coming? So what we see now is a lot of young people who are very pro-Bernie, and it has almost caused a massive schism in the Democratic Party, imperiling Clinton's chances in 2016. So can you speak to the popularity of Bernie, the viability of this fractured Democratic Party going forward into 2016, and then finally some views on Trump? Let's just talk about all three.
All right. Well, I'm an economist, and you have to make an allowance for me that if you come from the point of view of how the economy is working, it's not so surprising that in your explanation, in my response to your question, the role of our economy plays a big role. So let me get right to it. Capitalism in the United States and even in the world really crashed in 2008. And for most people, it has not yet recovered. And we are, as a nation, in a kind of state of denial, which isn't so surprising. It's a system we thought would last forever. It's a system we thought was upward and onward kind of all the time. So to face that it might not be that way is something very hard to get your head around. And that it takes some time isn't surprising, but I think we're seeing the results of both the crash and the denial. So let me explain. I think both the Republican and party establishments, let's call them the Bush kind of Republicans who ran the party up until recently, or the Clinton type on the Democratic side, hadn't a clue, partly because of this denial game, that the world had changed and that a large number of American people are very upset about what has happened to them, particularly over the last 7 or 8 years, but even in the longer frame for many of them as well. And that it really was only a matter of time before the economic downturn that they're living through would shape their politics, their attitudes. Number one. Number two, I think there are two groups, above all else, that have been really badly affected in the last 8 or 9 years. And I think that's not then a surprise that these are the two groups that favor, in one case, Trump on the Republican side, and on the other, Sanders on the Democratic side. So let me explain. The first group are white, working-class men, some with more education, some with less, who had, over the years, built up pretty good jobs in the United States, pretty secure jobs, often jobs with unions. Even when they didn't have unions, they had pretty good benefits. They could support themselves. They could be the father of the family and provide support to their kids and their spouse. And they had a sense that in America, the adage, if you work hard and keep your nose to the grindstone, you kind of will progress and you'll live in a better standard of living than your parents or grandparents did. Those people, white working men in secure jobs, have really been savaged over the last 20 years. And there have been two basic reasons. One, we've had a burst of technology that has replaced them with machinery. And that's not surprising because that's how capitalism works. The more you pay a worker, the greater the incentive you have to replace him with a machine, and that's what they did. The second thing, which is motivated in the same way, is making the jobs leave the United States and go to places where they can pay for the same work a small fraction of what they would have to pay an American worker. Between the jobs lost to automation and the jobs lost to outsourcing or relocating capitalist businesses, however you want to describe it, you really whacked the white working class male. Ironically, because those were the best paid, those were the chief targets for being replaced or displaced. The second group that has been shafted over the last 10 to 20 years has been young people, particularly those who go to the universities, but not just them. As the good jobs disappeared, the kinds of jobs that have been growing, the kinds of jobs that young people can expect to get when they come out of high school or college are increasingly retail, fast food, all of those kinds
waiters, bartenders, things like
right.
that.
And those people, by and large, don't get paid very well. And even in the few cases where they do, they have no job security, they have no benefits, they have no pension accruing to them. They're not really in very good shape. And when the bar goes down or goes out of business, they are literally back to square one in terms of trying to find a way to live. Those who are lucky enough or come from the right homes to go to college discovered that for the first time in American history, a college degree is less valuable as a ticket to a good job, at the same time that it has become more expensive than your strained family finances can allow you to pay for, so you go into tens of thousands of dollars of debt to get a degree that's worth less than it ever was before.
Those of you listening in the audience, this is coming from someone who has gone through the entire Ivy League system and now teaches within the system as well. So very interesting feedback. Go right ahead.
Right. Just to give it to you very personally, it's about once every 2 to 3 weeks, a student comes into my office and he or she discussed the term paper or the exam, or the usual thing. And then when the 10, 15, 20-minute conversation is over, I can sense that there's something else on the young person's mind that they want to talk about, but they're a little embarrassed or it's awkward. And so I try to, encourage them to feel free to talk. And out it comes. They've just had a traumatic telephone call from mother who explains that because dad lost his job or whatever the story is, they can't foot the bill for the next semester's fees at the college. The student is 3/4 of the way through, can't possibly imagine walking away from the university with $37,000 in debt and not even the little degree to show for it. So they're in a quandary, and then the tears start falling. By the way, from the young men, no less or more than from the young women, because they really don't know what to do and feel very betrayed. They were told to work hard, to study hard, to save their money. They did all those things, and they're going to the university. And by the way, these are perfectly good students who are in good standing in the course I'm teaching or in the university. And yet they find themselves in a terrible kind of dilemma for which there's no escape. Well, I think Bernie is capturing on his side the white working class man and the student and the young people, because for them, he says, I'm going to do something about the job you no longer have, about the debt you shouldn't have been required to build up in the first place, about the terribly low pay that a retail job or a fast food job gives you. These are not part of the America I believe in, that I'm going to do. And look, the truth of it is that the old families, the old traditions, symbolized by Bush and Clinton, are people who these folks don't trust anymore. They don't seem to get it. They don't seem to deal with it. If they even talk about these issues at all, they're in the kinds of platitudes that these folks no longer take seriously. They're looking for somebody who's a bit more believable. And I think Trump, in his unique way, I'll be polite, and Bernie, in his remarkably different way, represent somebody that maybe you can believe in. And I think for that reason, Bernie on his side and Trump on his side have surprised all of the political professionals, all of the pollsters, and everybody else who didn't see it coming. But I don't mean to be mean, but the truth of it is that's their own fault. They've been in a kind of denial about what's going on, and the mass of people are leaving them, and they had their first comeuppance in this race so far.
Interesting insights. I want to ask you one more thing about this, because when you go back and you study, and no one has probably studied this as you have studied democracy, you've studied, of course, the critics of capitalism with Marx. Let's go back and think for a moment, all the way back to Greece. Ancient Greece is where democracy was born. It was founded there. And over time, as you watch the evolution of the Greek democracy, what you find is that the governors or the rulers in place, what they would do is they would have to continue raising how much money you made before they would allow you to vote, because they didn't want everybody voting. They quickly discovered that was a bad idea. So they had to raise the bar and say you have to own this much land or you have to make this much income before you can actually participate in the democratic process. Aristotle was extremely worried about democracy. Then James Madison, more recently, he was very concerned about democracy as well. And this is why when you look at the foundation of America, you find a lot of wealthy men who are putting this together, and they're obviously designing it for their benefit, obviously. And so what we see now with Bernie Sanders is you have a guy who is rattling the gates, in my mind. He is reminding everyone in the country that they have equal rights. He's reminding everyone in the country that this is a democratic process and they don't have to stay home. They can come out. In fact, one of the things I heard Bernie say was that if he is elected and he does go to Washington, that one of the first things that he'll do is he will have a huge rally on Washington. All of the people who are out, who are angry, who are upset, he said, we'll just bring them there and that'll force change. He won't have to use the executive order. He'll just bring the people, invite them to Washington and let them demand change. So what I'm basically saying is that this seems as if this is what Aristotle feared. This is what James Madison feared. And Bernie is, while he's obviously has interesting ideas, he's tapping into something that could be, some opponents would say, he's tapping into the demise of democracy. He's bringing it down, something that Aristotle and Madison would have warned against. What's your response to that? And is that even a proper analysis?
Well, I think you're right about a fundamental problem. In ancient Greece, in ancient Athens, where this democratic ideal is supposed to have begun, it's always been a bit of an irony that when you go back and actually study the Athenian society of that time, what they meant was democracy for citizens of Athens, that was an economy based on slavery, and that no one ever extended the notion of democracy to include the slaves. So that right at the beginning, you had this peculiar notion, and they had to do that because if the slaves had been given equal rights with the masters, slavery would have been very short in its duration, to say the least, because the slaves were more numerous than the masters. In other words, you've always had the problem that if you have universal suffrage, if you give everybody, every adult, the vote, then the political system of voting will sooner or later suggest to the mass of people that you can use the vote to undo the effects of the economy. That, in other words, if the economy works to make a few people very rich and everybody else seriously pinched, well, then it won't take very long for people to say, okay, the economy is rigged against us, but we have one person, one vote, and we can recoup using politics what we have lost in the economic realm. And at that point, democracy becomes a challenge to the economic system. The way I see it, what Bernie is pointing towards. And I'm not sure at this point that he's doing more than pointing. I don't know what he will actually do if he does get elected. The forces arrayed against him are pretty strong and have been here a long time. But he is part of a process in which the mass of people are coming to have to face. Are they, and I'm talking about Americans like you and me, are they ready to engage in a political struggle to undo the effects of the economic system? Or do they want the economic system we have and are willing to sacrifice political democracy to keep it? That's a difficult choice. That's a hard thing to face, that you even have to choose it. But I believe that's where we are, and that's where we are going. And if I could say just one more word about it, the reason that that is happening is, in my view, and I'm an economist, I admit it, is the way our economic system is now working. It is, in fact, producing more and more wealth and concentrating it in the hands of fewer and fewer people. I mean, that is obvious. That's been going on for 40 or 50 years. The few efforts to refute that, which I've looked at, are really lame and kind of sad even to see, because you need to do such torture of the statistics that it's kind of funny almost. So we know that that's going on. Most Americans see it in 100 different ways. Up the street from where I live in Manhattan, a new building just went up, and the smallest studio, which is 800 square feet, not a heck of a lot, the smallest studio in that building cost $3 million to buy. You know, this is nuts. This is, you're creating society here in which masses of people can't, send their kid to college, can't really pay for the home they live in, or at least not without squeezing themselves, reading every day about billionaires and millionaires, literally watching a billionaire buy his way in part into the Republican nomination. I don't think that's sustainable. You can't have that. And the kind of blind determination of those folks to keep on accumulating and to get more and more and to outdo each other with their yachts and their houses in Switzerland and all the rest of it, while the mass of people are having a harder time. This is an explosion. And I'm very clear in my mind that if we don't do something early on when things are still manageable, which I think they still are, we're going to see historians looking back on us and wondering about America the way we now wonder about the empires of the past. When we look at the collapse of Rome or Greece or the British Empire, you kind of scratch your head and you say, wow, didn't they see it coming? Look at all the things we can point to now that they must have known then. Why didn't they do something? Well, I think the same applies to us right now in the United States. And I think the Bernie campaign and the Trump campaign are major weather vanes pointing to that.
You're listening to the voice of Professor Richard Wolff. He is the Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. In our final moments, Richard, if you would, just quickly tell our folks how they can learn more about you, watch your monthly video updates, and they can get your books. Just tell us where we can find more about you.
That's very kind, Jerry. Yeah, the best place to go are the two websites we maintain: Democracy at Work, that's all one word, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O. My own website, rdwolf with two Fs.com. I'm all over YouTube. Just look me up, Richard Wolff on YouTube. You'll find it. And the most recent book, which was released this month in May, is called Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, and you can get that through any of the book services across the country, available right now. So it's very kind of you to let me mention these things, but if you're interested in the kind of analysis I offer, those are the places where you can get it in detail.